I'm just going to start recording from here, but I will edit the recording just because I have a fear of forgetting and to hit record. It's happened and I've been like, oh no. So second. I'm just going to try to share my slides just to make sure it works and make sure I did that correctly. You guys can see that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I'm going into slideshow, that will work. Okay, perfect, cool. I will go back up here and I will stop sharing for now. Right, yeah, we should be good to go. So God bless Niamh. Niamh's having a busy day.
Yes.
Niamh went from baking scones to being on another webinar. So she's joining us in a minute or two. She said, she just texted me there that they're just wrapping up. But yeah, we should be good to go. How did your other webinar go, Ken? Actually, how'd it go?
Well, it was a mental health nurse from the UK, and she went through the process of struggles in life, to be honest, and then eventually sort of ticked off a lot of the boxes, and because she was in the profession herself, was able to find out she did have autism. Then there was the journey going through GPs, clinicians, other things to actually get the diagnosis.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. But one of the questions I was asking was, looking at it from a lay person's perspective, how did she find the process? And then, as a professional, how would she revise it? And she was saying she was lucky because she was a professional, she knew the process and was going along to the diagnosis. But, I have ADHD because of X, Y, or Z. Please send me to the next stage in the level. So
yes, yeah, fair enough. God, that's actually a really interesting perspective, to be fair. Can I just ask, is the As I Am logo reversed for you guys, or does it look normal?
Oh, good.
It looks normal, except your lovely head is in
the way.
Oh, that's grand. What's it?
I have to do this every now and then to get the logo.
Yeah, I'm just like, I'll just have a meeting halfway through. Yeah, no, we're trying to get into the habit of us all having the background, but I think the guys on admin thought that they had to reverse the image first, so everyone's looks mirrored, and we're all just really bad at technology, so none of us are able to cope with it.
I think it depends on how your video is set up, because my video is actually reversed, I think. Because it disconcerts people when they look at themselves, and it's not what they tend to see in a mirror, because we look different.
Yeah, oh my God, that tells you I haven't even noticed. God, okay. I'll be just staring at myself the whole time and be like, lost my own eyes. Niamh's joining us now. God bless her. I will just make her a co-host as well. Make a co-host. Here we go.
Can I just ask before we go in, just probably for Niamh as well, does this sound okay? So if Niamh is going to omit that, most neurotypical people are very sympathetic. So I've just done up this really quickly, and I just want to make sure that it's okay with everyone. So what I said was the original wording of this question was most neurotypical people are very sympathetic. However, we chose to omit it as we didn't want people to think that this was language that we were endorsing or encouraging the use of. However, we felt it was also important at the same time to take the opportunity to highlight the importance of everyone taking responsibility and ownership for their words and actions. And we know the power words have, so we need to choose them carefully. Does that sound okay?
I think that's fair. I mean, I don't even know if you need to say the bit about us feeling the need to omit it. Even because in reality, I think it's worth bringing up regardless, and just say that you could always say it in a way of because I suppose I don't want to sound like we're singling out whoever asked that question.
Yeah,
and that was the one that was the nicest of phrasing as well.
And that is the nicest of phrases. So I don't really want to feel like I'm like, oh God, that's our best ally there. It might be worth just saying that, you've seen that question asked in other ways, most common using this kind of language, just so it doesn't sound like we're saying someone on the call right now.
We're going to say bold.
The call came from inside the house, or something like that. I don't know. Does that make sense? I don't know if that does. That might just be my notion.
When I asked it, I was just going to say, more so many neurotypical people now are very interested in learning more X, Y, and Z, and leave out the sympathy piece. altogether, if that makes sense.
I think though that does that not change the question? It's
so
just I've written up my answer to the question.
I understand. Okay.
Essentially, after you left there to make scones and be very busy, God bless you, Niamh, fair play to you. We were just talking about that question, and essentially we were like, you know, maybe it is worth addressing the language people use to even ask their questions. So like that, I would say for you, Niamh, word it whatever way you want to word it. Because at the same time, when we're asking the questions and you're an As I Am moderator and everything like that, you don't want to use language maybe like that, but the Caoimhe does want to take the opportunity to address how some people refer to it, if that makes sense. But we're also just not trying not to call out the specific person who asked the question.
Yeah, that's what I was quite conflicted with that, because like obviously Dyslexia Association, we don't call out somebody for their writing and how they construct a sentence.
Yes,
but,
that's right.
And that's why I was so conflicted with, do I leave it and not say anything? But the wording just didn't sit right with me.
Well, I think it's worth acknowledging, especially because even if we're not saying it out loud, we know that the number of questions we got actually had a huge degree of sympathetic was the nicest phrase used.
Okay.
There was a lot of very hit and miss language, which once again, it's a language webinar and that's totally fine. But maybe it is worth acknowledging.
I think it definitely is worth acknowledging, because the amount of there's only so much modeling of language you can do as well. I genuinely think people don't realize the language that they're using when they're speaking. Yeah, so I think sometimes it needs to be explicitly said.
Yeah. But like that, I would say, Niamh, for you, let Caoimhe will address that, but ask the question whatever way you are comfortable phrasing it, if that makes sense.
Will I just, it's the As I Am piece. I'm thinking I wouldn't want to say that.
Literally what I said earlier. Yeah. So I was saying, I had said that you were going to ask it at the end of the day, you're representing As I Am. It's just that Caoimhe in her answer is going to acknowledge maybe other ways she's heard the question phrased in the past throughout her work and kind of maybe refer to it like that.
Perfect.
Does that make sense? Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, are we?
Can I just say for the rest of the question though, is it going to be quite similar to that? It's just because I just have language is always changing. I don't want to sound like I've answered a completely different question. Do you know what I mean?
I totally get you. So, you know, I'll probably just say about neurotypical people who are very keen to learn the new language, but is it a good idea to increase their workload with a load of the only change is the sympathetic piece?
Yeah, super.
Yeah,
super.
That's fair. Yeah. Okay, are we good to go?
Yep.
I might just say when somebody else is speaking that the rest of us mute.
Yeah, perfect.
Say this as someone, I was on a webinar the last day and I didn't realize I was on mute and I got a coughing fit, so that's for me.
Jen, they're going to kill me. I don't have my background, but too little, too late.
Don't worry, it's okay. I'll cover for you. It's all good. You're fine. Okay, so participants are joining now. Yeah, the attendee list should be visible to everyone anyway. Okay, and you guys as co-hosts can see the attendees in the participant list and everything, can't you? Yeah, that's visible for everyone. Okay, cool. Perfect. You know, it's always very nice and slightly daunting to see the number go up, isn't it? Every time I'm like, oh, that's very gratifying and terrifying, but sure. Okay, so I might just say as a reminder to any participants joining that closed captioning is available as well. If anyone wants to turn that on the bottom, the transcript's also available and recordings on. So all of those should be available to you. There should also be interpretation as well, just in case anyone wants to avail of that as well. Okay, so I'm not sure if the number is still going up or if we should get started. Maybe give it another minute, I suppose. But I suppose I can do our introductions anyway and kind of get the ball rolling there. But the first thing I'd like to say, I suppose, is to welcome everyone who's joining us. And I know I said it was intimidating, but it is actually really nice to have large numbers of interest as well in this topic. This is a collaborative webinar, which is so brilliant. And I don't know, I find it personally really exciting because we have representatives from the Dyslexia Association of Ireland, ADHD Ireland and Dyspraxia Ireland. as well as myself. I'm here representing As I Am, and we're going to be talking about language, neurodiversity affirmative language, what that even is. But we thought, you know, it was really important to make sure this is a collaborative approach to that conversation, because in reality, neurodiversity is a multifaceted topic. So I'm just going to thank everyone for joining. And I think we still have people joining actually, which is great. But I might just share my screen now just to make sure that is working. Everyone. And if my fellow panelist could let me know whether you can see that when that starts. Just a thumbs up. Perfect. Great. Excellent. So yeah, I'll just continue with our introduction because I'm aware we're kind of, you know, trying to pack a lot into an hour, but hopefully all be very worthwhile conversation. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. We have a pretty big cohort with us, but we also have a huge cohort looking Dyspraxia Ireland. There's myself from As I Am, and we have Caoimhe O'Malley from the Dyslexia Association of Ireland. So between us, we're going to be answering some questions this evening, having a general conversation as well about everything to do with language. And I might just turn off my camera if that's all right, just in case my connection is a little bit weak. That might help with the screen share. So there we go. So that's kind of who's with us here today. We also have Ken from ADHD Ireland as well in the background moderating for us. And we have Niamh from As I Am, who's going to be asking us some questions, which is brilliant. And we're going to get going pretty soon on those questions, but I just wanted to do a little bit of an introduction and touch on some key points, because in reality, I'm not really sure how everyone else feels about language in general, but I know myself that I can feel a little bit daunted by it and approaching it. So it can be a little bit intimidating. So I just want to touch on some key points before we get started and get into the meat of those questions. So as you might see there, the Q&A function is enabled. You can ask your questions throughout this, just, you know, if anything pops up, you have a thought, you'd like to share it. The Q&A function is open. We will hopefully get to a few questions at the end, but as you'll see, we are directly answering questions based on questions we received from the community on a survey. But hopefully we might have time at the end for a few. The chat function is also enabled if you would like to contact our panelists, the co-hosts, anyone like that, just in case you have an issue maybe, or you want to check a detail or something like that, you can privately message us there. And of course, follow-up and recordings is just to let you know that any slides, documentation, anything like that, and the recording, I'll follow up with everyone tomorrow and issue that as well, just in case you want to watch it back or share it with somebody else who wasn't able to be here. So I suppose it's very important for us here to note that the questions that we're going to be answering in rotation are about neurodiversity affirmative language, but also about neurodiversity in general. And then we have more specific questions, whether it's about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, those kind of, I suppose, what comes under the definition of neurodiverse conditions, really. And these questions are going to come directly from a survey that thankfully we got an amazing response from our various communities. Everyone was so responsive and had very fleshed out and I suppose coherent questions that I think resonated with me really when I was going through them. So together we identified some common themes to help inform our questions, and those are who we're going to be addressing today. And we are going to be going through these, but I think it's important to note that at the start of our survey, we asked two very short questions about neurodiversity affirmative language, just to get, I suppose, people's opinions on things, and also get their opinions on language, how confident people feel. For me, it can feel a little bit, I suppose, a little bit nerve-wracking, because there's a sense where you really want to do the right thing and you really want to make sure you're not offending anyone. So it was really interesting to see when we asked how confident do you feel using neurodiversity affirmative language, that the average response was 61% confident. But what I would note within that is there was actually a huge range of different statistics, really. There was absolutely a massive range, really, where people said they felt incredibly, I suppose, unsure. And then some people felt really confident, but wanted to attend the webinar just to make sure they were up to date on their language. So that breadth of experience was really represented in the survey. And I think that will be obvious in the questions that follow. And the second question we asked, which was equally as informative, was how well do you feel that you understand the term neurodivergent? This was a really interesting one as well, just to see, I suppose, the different scopes of people's feelings. And I think it's understandable entirely that a huge amount of people felt like they somewhat understood it. A lot of people elaborated on their answer to this question actually at the end of the survey by saying that they felt somewhat confident, but maybe had a little bit of doubts about how language changes over time and being able to keep up with that kind of change. So it was really, really interesting to get that. And I think maybe that's important for us to start with, to understand that everyone here, and maybe everyone who was going to watch the recording back, we're all coming at this from a really learning perspective, and from trying our best really to improve our understanding of things, and we're all just doing our best, but there is huge room for feeling unsure, and we should be able to express that lack of certainty as well. So once again, another thing I'm just going to touch on here is actually in direct response to a few questions we received, which was really interesting, was a lot of people didn't have specific questions, but did have a specific anxiety, I suppose, or a worry. And they expressed the worry that they weren't using the correct language, or the right language. And usually this is followed up by a fear of offending someone, whether it's a family member or friend, or some people said that they felt that they were not using the correct language to represent their own community well. If they were, maybe autistic or dyspraxic or dyslexic, it was really, really interesting how often this word correct came up in terms of language. And I think that was really worth discussing and noting here, that between, I suppose, all of the panelists here, we've had numerous conversations about this and how there is no real correct language. There is each of us trying our best to be informed by kindness, by respect, by empathy, for our communities, trying to respect the language people want to use, and also having that attitude that we're all still learning. But that means that the ground underneath your feet can feel like it's changing a lot when it comes to language. And I wanted to acknowledge that from the off and say that there is not going to be a tick box right or wrong here. People will have different nuanced opinions. We see it all the time, when we're talking to the autistic community, for example, about the language people like to use to refer to themselves, to others, what they want their family to say versus what their family believe they should say, things like that all of the time. It's a more nuanced discussion than maybe just right or wrong, correct or offensive. And that's important. And maybe because of that nuance, it can be very difficult to form a consensus around absolute opinions, because there's no absolutes really when it comes to language, because anything based on opinion, maybe feeling, people's identity, and of course everyone's different approaches and stages they're at with their own self-identifying journey maybe, and self-acceptance can change things. So that can really alter our ability to form a consensus as any kind of community. So I'd like to just keep that in mind as we go through the questions, but I think that'll be important maybe as we're going forward. And I know Sonia's going to probably talk about that a little bit more later on, the idea of forming a consensus and the impossible task that can feel like sometimes. So I just want to begin, I suppose, by touching on our key terms that are, in the title of the webinar even, and bringing those up, because these are terms that are going to be used throughout the webinar very frequently, but they can feel a little bit mountainous, I suppose, in terms of approaching them. at first when you're maybe at the beginning of a journey of learning about this. And in terms of neurodiversity essentially as a concept originated in the 90s, very simply from an autistic sociologist, Judy Singer. And it was very simply meant to refer to an acknowledgement that everyone's brain developed quite differently. And the concept itself very quickly took off with autistic rights activists and within the autistic community. However, the autistic community very quickly recognized that actually there's quite a lot of overlap between the experiences of the autistic community and other people who had other conditions, you know, whether it was dyslexia, whether it was dyspraxia, whether it was a mental health condition, for example. There's a huge variety, and this community continued to grow. And that was, I suppose, how the term neurodiversity has continued to grow and flesh out. And that's something I think it might be important for us to start on, is the idea that neurodiversity and neurodivergent as terms are not medicalized terms themselves. They're part of a social identity and a social community. The autistic rights activists at the time in the 90s recognized the struggles that other communities had that were similar to them when they were looking for, you know, autonomy, when they were looking at imbalances of power, when they were looking to advocate for themselves in healthcare and education, things like that. And that's where neurodiversity and essentially the meaning of someone's brain developing differently, and by differently we just mean different to what is considered typical. And that's where I suppose those autistic rights activists realized there was a lot more commonality with other communities. And it's fleshed out, obviously, and grown so much since then. So in terms, short terms, I guess, when we say neurodivergent and neurodiverse, they can be used, I suppose, sometimes in conversation. We can hear them used almost interchangeably. And I'm sure, you know, technically, I suppose, we have a grammatical sense of what's right and wrong, I think it's important once we understand people's intention behind the language they use. And if they make a slight error, or maybe there's maybe grammatical error there, it's not the end of the world. But it's important for us maybe to recognize here that neurodivergent refers to the individual whose brain develops differently than whatever is considered typical. And that neurodiverse is a group of people. So the neurodiverse community, you know, neurodiverse family members I have, if I was referring to more than one person. But once again, I think as these terms change and move throughout society, and we have conversations, whether it's in Facebook groups, whether it's online, whether it's in these webinar chats, there's a level of, you know, nuance in those casual, informal conversations where people might use them in maybe a way that is technically not correct. But at the same time, I think once we're looking at the intention of someone's communication and how they're trying their best, I think we should have a level of grace about it. But it's always good, I suppose, to start with those definitions still at the same time. And here is an example, I suppose, of some of the conditions that come under the definition of neurodiversity. And by bearing in mind that neurodiversity is not a medicalized term or recognized, you know, in a medicalized sense, and it's very much socially linked to different communities. And we think about it back to Judy Singer's exceptionally simple way of putting it, the idea of just a brain difference, a different neurology, a different way of thinking, a different way of viewing the world. It makes, of course, sense that we would have people, you know, that have maybe learning differences, where there's mental health conditions as well, and everything like that. So it can be, whilst I suppose the autistic community was very involved in those early days, once again, it got fleshed out very, very, very early. But also it's important to note that even this example and this graphic, as helpful as it is only one example of how someone might view neurodiversity. It's only one lens through that. And it's that idea that whenever we're talking about large cohorts of people, large communities, altogether, there is going to be differences of opinion. And just to have that level of understanding about that. I know we received the question actually a lot before this webinar in our emails and things like that, of people asking, you know, I was just wondering, how come mental health conditions, for example, come under the umbrella of neurodiversity? Or is that correct to say? Because I say that, but I don't know if that's accurate. And once again, I think that's where the piece is, where we have that idea that maybe neurodiversity is a medicalized idea. But actually, when we look at it in terms of social communities, communities that have different social, whether it's social struggles, social challenges, but also social experiences in common, that we can see that actually it's where that overlap comes in. And it's where, if we look at it as a difference of thinking, the difference in different conditions comes in. But once again, someone's definition of neurodiversity, what maybe they consider to fit under that umbrella, is going to vary based on their personal experience to a degree as well. And that's, once again, I suppose, all of us keeping in mind our level of nuance as we're going forward in this conversation. So as we're wrapping up here, I just included, I suppose, a little bit of a language recap, but also because some people asked in our survey, which was great, just if we could include some slides with some definitions so that people could have them afterwards. So I've included these here. And I suppose our big ones here is that we're talking about neurodivergent when describing an individual person, and neurodiverse when we're talking about a group of people. And when we say neurodiversity itself, we're essentially referring to the natural diversity of human brains, human development, which I think the original example Judy Singer used actually might have been related to twins. And if you had identical twins, their brains would be entirely different, and that it's no different for the rest of the community and the rest of the population. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I'm just going to, there we go. And I'm just going to hand us over to the wonderful Niamh. Niamh's here as a representative of As I Am, and she's so kindly agreed to moderate for us and to kind of help us work through these questions that we got in the survey as we work through them all together. And I'll hand you over to Niamh now, because I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing me speak. So.
Never tired of hearing you speak, Jen. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on. I think it was a brilliant idea to bring all of these wonderful organisations together for this. So I would have been attending anyway, so I might as well ask the questions. And I suppose our first question, and just to say, so these questions have come in directly from our different communities, and I will stick to their wording as much as possible. So I suppose I'm a direct vehicle of the questions to our different professionals here. So I'll first go to Dr. Sonia Morris, or Sonia as I call her, and our question is, some sources suggest that intellectual disability and mental health conditions are included in the umbrella of neurodiverse conditions, but yet many others other definitions only include the ones that you have named here, and they refer to autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia. And I suppose this person wants to know, what is the prevailing consensus on this?
And the short answer is that there is no prevailing consensus at all. I think that was covered quite well by Jen at the very beginning. Our understandings and the way we look at neurodiversity and neurodivergence can vary from one individual to another, from one profession to another, from the community to the medical profession as well. It's all very different understandings. What's I suppose unusual about this shift in language use that's been happening over the past couple of decades is that usually when a shift in language comes in a medical sort of way, it is from the medical community and drips downwards. So if you take the example of how we don't use Asperger's anymore to refer to autistic individuals, or if you're using an ADHD example, ADD has been removed from our diagnostic manuals as clinicians. That takes a while for even the clinical community to get a hold of and to get used to. So a lot of clinicians might still use Asperger's. A lot of clinicians might still give a diagnosis of ADD, even though technically that isn't the language that medics use anymore. And it just takes a while to filter through. What's happening with the language use that we're discussing this evening as part of the neuroaffirmative paradigm is that this change and this shift has really come from advocacy groups and the communities themselves. And that's taking an even longer time to filter its way upwards. So if you look at reports that are being written by clinicians, if you look at teams that are providing intervention, you might find that their language use varies drastically from team to team or from individual clinician to individual clinician, because there's no consensus within those communities, which makes it even harder then for people who are receiving diagnoses to get a handle on language use too. So there is no consensus, and it will take longer, I think, for this language use to come into full effect and for everybody to be using it. But there is positive changes. Like I remember about 5 years ago, I was trying to publish a paper, and the journal got back to me and said, you need to change your language use to people with autism, and I had been using identity first language, whereas now you see journal articles now insisting on identity first language. So that shift is happening within different communities. It's just taking a slow time to work its way upwards and across.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Okay, we'll move on to our next question. And this question is for Caoimhe from Dyslexia Association of Ireland. So we know that, the majority of neurotypical people are very open and keen to learn. However, this individual wondered, is it a good idea to increase the workload, for want of a better word, for neurotypical people with a lot of new words to learn on top of, their day-to-day life? And I suppose they are asking the question that if individuals are doing their best to understand, should we not be making it more difficult in introducing a whole host of new language?
Perfect, thank you. So I just wanted to kind of highlight first that sometimes I've seen questions like this posed, and maybe some of the language might be viewed as being insensitive or negative. So sometimes we might see words like, neurotypical individuals would have high levels of sympathy for a neurodivergent person. So I think it was important just to take that opportunity to maybe highlight the importance of everyone taking responsibility and ownership for their words and actions, because we do know the power that words have. So we need to choose them carefully, and highlighting that word sympathy. It does have negative connotations, and there is a sense that, you're pitying a neurodivergent person, and this should never be the case. Instead, it should be about respect and support. And in terms of, language and adding maybe to people's workload, it is important that we note language is changing and evolving all the time, and that also reflects our society. We are becoming more open, and this does mean that we're constantly learning, and we do need to adapt to this newfound knowledge. So no, I don't feel that we're adding to people's workloads or maybe making it more difficult for neurotypical people, because really what we're asking them is to be mindful and respectful of the language that they use. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you so much, Caoimhe. And my next question is for Jen from As I Am, who remembered to use her As I Am background, and it's making me look bad with my wall background, but here we are. And this is a question that, would be core to much of our discussion and work in As I Am, and I suppose every organisation here, and that would be, how can we influence the discussion around neurodiversity to move away from the language of disorder and disease towards embracing diversity?
That question is something that I suppose I could almost immediately rattle off an answer for, but actually in reality I can feel whenever that comes up, even in work, if someone's emailed a question about that, like my heart rate nearly rises, as because I'm autistic myself. I also have ADHD, and I know what it is to be around people who maybe use language related to, disorder, disease, a deficit-based language, I guess, really. And I know even if their intention is so good and they're engaging with me in a really meaningful conversation, there's still a small slice of pain for that little bit of a moment. And it's something that I think for a long time, many of us have just maybe put up with, because we've struggled to even talk about why it's hurtful to a degree. But in reality, I know from talking to the adult community so much within the conversations, not just about autism, but about neurodiversity in general, really, is that the best thing we can do is include these people in the conversations and take on board their feedback and take on board our opinion
Jen, I think you're frozen.
I think I froze there.
Just for a minute.
I'll turn off my camera again.
Okay, so I think when you had spoken to that piece of when we speak to people directly in the community themselves, yes. I think if you go from there.
Yes. So people in the community, I suppose, and a lot of, I suppose, people I talk to would be specifically the autistic adult community, would talk about, I suppose, their particular wish to be included in the conversation, but also for people not to simply speak in, I suppose, speak out of a need to be respectful because it is the right thing to do, but also out of a level of genuine empathy and connection with someone's experience of what it is to see the world differently. And I think when we start viewing these conversations as less daunting, less intimidating, and more in the spirit of trying our best to be kind, I think we naturally start aligning ourselves away from conversations around, you know, maybe that disordered language, disease, deficit, all of those ideas, and stop seeing things as maybe lack and start seeing things as difference. I think it's a natural pull when we really recenter why we are doing this and recenter kindness in that.
Thank you, Jen. I think it's such a good point in that, you know, when we kind of make language changes because we've learned we should, but then we're not actually thinking about the implication of those words. When we engage with the implications, kind of has a natural effect on our language. So I'm just going to come over to Sam now from Dyspraxia Ireland, and I suppose staying very much on the same theme, but maybe taking it a step back to those who might be new to the language of person first and identity first. So Sam, if you would mind explaining what's the difference between person first and identity first language, and which do the communities prefer?
Yeah, identity first language is really just about putting the person first, which is very much in the name. I'll use dyspraxia as an example. Like I would prefer to say that I am dyspraxic rather than I have dyspraxia. And I think for me that I prefer that way because sometimes I can kind of feel like saying that I have dyspraxia makes me feel like I have something wrong with me, whereas saying that I am dyspraxic just makes me feel like it's just another part of me and it's just who I am and my different way of thinking. And I find that really helpful. And I think I know with other communities, people like to say that I am autistic rather than I have autism and things like that. And I know Sonia's going to speak a little bit more about ADHD in that aspect later, but it's just something like for me, like saying I am a brunette, like it's just a part of who I am. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable within my identity to use that. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I suppose my next question is for Sonia, and is leading on again from that identity first or person first debate. And I suppose one that comes up a lot with ADHD, doesn't it? So Sonia, how, you know, if you could explain how to identify someone with ADHD, not in the diagnostic sense, but in how we, I suppose, you know, referring between person first or identity first. So if this person is asked, would you say with ADHD, or would you say ADHDer, or what do you think?
I cannot answer this question. I think we were talking about it as panelists earlier on. Some of the different neurodivergent conditions that are mentioned here lend themselves very well to identity first language. It rolls off the tongue: autistic, dyspraxic, dyslexic. ADHD is an acronym and doesn't lend itself very well to that. There is no consensus on what way we should be addressing ADHD if we're to use identity first language. So I personally alternate between they're an ADHDer or they're an ADHD person. But then, you know, members of the ADHD community much prefer using saying that they are a person with ADHD, far more so than I think when we look at particularly the autistic community, that there's seems to be a lot more consensus over identity first language being used. So there's movement towards identity first language being used within the ADHD community, but lack of consensus over what that might look like. And they're the two options that are out there at the moment, referring to a person as an ADHDer or an ADHD person. So we will just have to watch the space. But I think somebody had said in the chat function, which leads very nicely on from this discussion is consensus useful? And just to say that yes, it is, whether it's consensus on what counts as neurodivergence, or consensus on how we use language. Language is really important. It shapes how we see something, and how we support individuals, and the focus of our work, particularly as clinicians. If we use person first language and say something with, it seems like something that's external to a person and something that we could perhaps remove from a person, or that is undesirable in a person. Whereas if we're using identity first language, exactly like Sam was saying, it becomes an integral part of that person, something that we don't want to take away, because it would take away part of their personhood. So the interventions as a clinician look very different. So consensus does become really important in that regard, because it shapes everything, how society interacts with those communities.
Absolutely, and it's great to see the conversation opening up in the chat as well about this topic, because I suppose tonight isn't just about, you know, centering the conversation of ourselves and the panelists, but also opening up that discussion more broadly. So definitely keep those comments coming. It's great to see them coming in. I'll go back now to Caoimhe from Dyslexia Ireland, and a question came in around the possibility of, in this person's terminology, overcoming dyslexia. So this person said they see this language used a lot in psychology reports. So the idea of this person will overcome dyslexia and assessments, but to them it felt very negative, and can be overwhelming, they described, to read. So what would you think to that, Caoimhe?
Yeah, so first of all, just to highlight, you don't overcome dyslexia, you're not going to outgrow your dyslexia, and you're not going to cure somebody's dyslexic profile. It is a lifelong identification, so that is important to note there. I agree, words like this are very negative, and it is disappointing to hear that psychologists are using these words in their reports and assessments. And it's probably, it's poor choice of words, which is very misleading, and at times can be damaging to somebody. When somebody uses words like this, it could be argued that it demonstrates a lack of understanding and awareness of dyslexia. It also lends itself to maybe the idea that some people might be, copying and pasting from other program descriptors. Sometimes we do see descriptors talking about, using programs and this will help you overcome your dyslexia, or maybe an early identification gives you the best chance at overcoming your dyslexia. But again, it's an incorrect use of word because it leads to misunderstanding. People think then that they can, outgrow or cure or overcome their dyslexic profile. So it is really important that when we see language like this or hear language like this, that we do try and reframe it, and that we're always being mindful and ensure that we never replicate or kind of reproduce language like this in any of our verbal or written communications. Perfect.
Absolutely. Thanks. And we certainly discuss overcoming barriers that society have created for neurodivergent individuals. But yeah, I'd absolutely agree. Just a reminder to our participants, if you do have questions, to pop them into the Q&A box. It's great to see the comments coming through the chat, but if you put your question in the Q&A, it'll allow the panel to work through them if we have a little bit of time at the end. So coming back now to Jen, and I suppose it's a natural follow-on from the conversation around consensus, is of course consensus refers to a group usually, but of course their individuals are within this group. So an individual was wondering, is it preferable to use the term which the person is comfortable, even if it's not the currently advised term? So for example, a person might describe themselves as having Asperger's syndrome.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm just going to keep my camera off just to be safe. And
okay.
We're all fine. But I spoke to really, really clearly there was that idea of consensus. But at the end of the day, communities this large are made up of individuals. And I think it's important to note that, particularly when we're talking as well about autism and accessing maybe an autism assessment, and when you're approaching that journey towards, maybe coming to terms with your autistic identity, what that means for you, particularly if you're late diagnosed, it's not a journey that is without emotion. and without individual experiences that absolutely form our opinions. So a lot of the time, you know, and I see this a lot of the time in different groups that I run with As I Am, and I hear some people introduce themselves as autistic and other people say that they have Asperger's syndrome. Other people use other language, they might prefer to say with autism, something like that. And reality is that we try to bring it back to respect and understanding that there's layers to the language that every single is and it's not personal experience. And I find that really, really useful to understand and to remember. So in that context, I like to remember that, yes, we can see that language changes over time. I actually had an occupational therapist say to me recently that they felt like the term Asperger's syndrome just disappeared over time. Whereas in reality, language like that changes for specific reasons and connotations and connections. But for example, if someone was, you know, receiving their diagnosis before the term was dropped, which I think was in 2013, if I'm remembering right, they might have gotten used to that identity for a while. They might have come to terms with the idea of saying Asperger's and understood themselves in the context of that word. And I think it's important for us to remember the emotional connection to self and to understanding your identity. And once again, when we recenter that idea of individuals and doing what's kind, we can understand that actually, when it comes to respecting people, doesn't have to be that difficult, really. So I would just say, where possible, respect others. If someone asks you to educate them and says, actually, why don't we say Asperger's anymore, which is a question I've been asked as an autistic person, and things like that, it's absolutely fine to educate. But if someone expressly says, I'm actually more comfortable using this, I think it's important to understand that's their journey and their experience, and I'm going to be with you and respecting you on that.
Thank you, Jen. And we'll go over now to Sam from Dyspraxia Ireland. And Sam, this is a two-parter question, really. So I'll come to the first part. And this person, you know, they note that autistic and dyslexic have become generally accepted terms, and that speaks to that consensus piece. But as Sonia mentioned, I think that consensus is not across all areas of neurodivergence. So this person is wondering, is dyspraxic the correct term?
Yeah, dyspraxic would definitely be widely used. I use it myself, and any of my friends or colleagues that I've worked with are very happy with using the term dyspraxic. Yeah.
Okay, and their second parter is they're wondering, is dyspraxia often linked to dyslexia and dyscalculia? And they note that they don't feel that it seems to be as widely understood.
Yeah, I'm really, really glad that that question was asked and brought up, because it does sometimes feel like dyspraxia is kind of a bit of the underdog in the neurodivergent community. And there are overlapping symptoms, of course, with dyscalculia and dyslexia, and there can be some similar traits. But, you know, there's a lot about dyspraxia that is very important to be recognized, especially how much of it, the aspects of it that it can affect like our fine gross motor skills. And there's a huge physical aspect to it, and that really needs to be looked at and really needs to be, you know, recognized that there is that difference there. And that's why the diagnosis of dyspraxia is very, very important to have and to understand. And I don't know, I think maybe part of the reasons why it is so kind of under the radar might be it is kind of difficult to explain with just a one-liner, and there are a lot of complexities to it. But it really is you know, important and great that it's kind of getting recognized a lot more, and even just to be included in conversations like these is really, really great. So yeah, saying dyspraxic is accepted, and it's important to distinguish as well, because it can be a little frustrating when I say to someone that I'm dyspraxic and they go, oh, do you mean like dyslexia or do you mean dyscalculia? And it's kind of like, I do know my own, like who I am as a person, and it can kind of feel a little bit frustrating. So like obviously more awareness is better, and understanding that dyspraxia has its own area and is its own thing too, as much as it does kind of overlap in some ways. But yeah, that's kind of it.
Absolutely, Sam. And it's like you say, I suppose dyspraxia it is in some ways difficult to describe in a one sentence. There's so many aspects. And I sound like a granny, but in a time of social media where, you know, everything is described via kind of infographics and so on, nuance can get lost very quickly, can't it? And Sonia, coming back to you now, and actually I think this topic is coming up a bit in the chat, and this question comes in from a parent or a guardian, I'm assuming. So they're wondering, is there any move away from ADHD? By what they mean is that as a name, not ADHD at all. So any move away from ADHD, especially the disorder, the D. It has such, they note, it has such negative connotations, but there are, of course, strengths to having ADHD too. And they give such an important insight where they're saying, you know, I don't know how to make my child aware of their strengths while also telling them they have a disorder by using the word ADHD. It feels counterintuitive. Yeah, so I'm wondering, what would your thoughts be there?
I think I can put it in the chat there earlier that ADHD is a double whammy because it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we have two negatives squeezed into that acronym. Half of it is negative. Whereas if we look at dyspraxia and we look at dyslexia, both of those terms, you know, they stand alone very well. And then with autism, I suppose the official diagnosis that you will see in most reports is autism spectrum disorder. And I think that community have done really well in, I suppose, redefining it as ASC, so changing the name, and that was socially driven, or just using autism spectrum as well in reports and things like that. The same can be done for ADHD. It just hasn't been done as of yet that I've seen on a wide scale. There was some suggestions in the chat. Neurospicy really took my attention when it came up in the chat. I do think there are ways around it. I mean, even if you, like, everybody knows the acronym ADHD. But there were some suggestions there that you could keep the acronym and change it to diverse or different and those sorts of things. But I feel that this person's main question is actually, you know, how do we explain to you know, whether it be our child or to ourselves, to family members, to the public, that ADHD is more than just a grouping of what can be perceived as deficits, that there are huge strengths associated with ADHD. And that's the same with every neurodivergence that we're talking about here today. Every neurodivergent individual has strengths associated with that diagnosis. And it can be tricky explaining these things when it has disorder or in the title. And I suppose it's really about what ADHD means for the person when you're discussing it with a child, for example. And there was a question that came through from the panelists as well, is, you know, how do I explain this to my child? And it's quite apt to follow up on that here as well. It is about looking for what ADHD means to them and the strengths that are associated with that, and that they are differences in brain development. I think another question that came up was about disability, and if it's okay to use the term disability. I think, you know, disability is a kinder term to use than disorder, because you're acknowledging to the child or to the person that you can be disabled by the environment that you're living in. But and that's nothing that's internally wrong or you know, wrong about you. So if you take, for example, a child in a classroom who has a lot of activity levels and likes to move and likes to stand up when they're eating their lunch, they're being disabled by the classroom environment when they're being forced to sit down. But that's a difference in how their brain works and a difference in their energy levels they have. So explaining it in those terms to a child, that, you know, you work differently and you require different supports, or you require different accommodations in your environment that may be different from other kids in your class. It's a much kinder way to describe it. But I agree with that parent that disorder is not necessarily the nicest word to use with a child, especially when you're trying to be neuroaffirmative. But a great question from that parent, because it is one that pops up quite a lot.
Yeah,
I see more suggestions coming in through the chat about ways we could change it. I think Ken is organizing a focus group on what we should, what ways we should be moving forward.
And I completely agree, Sonia. I think it was a brilliant question, and something I'm sure lots of parents are working through individually as well with their child. So I'll come back to Quiva now from Dyslexia Ireland. And a person was wondering, they ask, is it incorrect to describe dyslexia as just jumping, a tongue teaser, just jumping words on a page. Are dyslexic people's experiences diverse or uniform? And how best can we describe these? So there's a few elements to those that question there, isn't there?
Yeah. Perfect. So thank you. So first of all, I think this idea of, words jumping on a page in unstable text, sometimes this could be seen as maybe a very simplified way of describing what goes on for somebody during the reading process. It's also something that we hear maybe quite young people describing when they're discussing reading, or just trying to maybe find the vocabulary or the words to describe their dyslexia and what they see when they try to read. Sometimes this is for maybe numerous different reasons. As I said, they're trying to find a vocabulary to explain maybe their challenges or their differences. But also sometimes what we find is it's what they've heard and what they've seen. A lot of the time, if you Google dyslexia and reading, and for our images, we see the text and it's in this kind of jumbled, unstable state on the page, or there's images of it coming up off the page for dyslexic. So sometimes people think this is what dyslexia is, and it's the best way that they can describe it, but it wouldn't always be kind of best practice, and that idea of kind of the word just, words jumping on a page. Unfortunately, dyslexia is very complex. It's not just one thing, so we do have to be mindful of that as well. Sometimes also that idea of maybe unstable text can be how the information is presented to somebody. So if it's not presented in a dyslexia friendly manner, it can cause difficulties, and it may not be accessible for people. So we do have to be mindful how we present our materials. In terms of dyslexic people's experience, and are they diverse or uniform? Everyone with dyslexia is different. Dyslexia is very complex. However, there is kind of a commonality of challenges and difficulties, and these tend to be reading, writing, spelling, and kind of related cognitive and processing difficulties. There's also some co-occurring challenges, and we say that these may be common, but they aren't something that we see maybe in every dyslexic individual. So it's important that we understand some people, they may impact some people but not everybody, and some of these might be around organizational skills, maybe directional skills, or time management. So that's kind of why we say yes, there is a commonality, but there's also a lot of diversity within the dyslexic community. So it's really important that we never make any assumptions about a person or their experiences, and the person with dyslexia should always be at the heart of any of these conversations, because they know best how their dyslexia impacts them and how it presents for them. What also may be beneficial here, if you want to learn maybe more about, or if this person wants to learn more about people's experiences with dyslexia, on our website, I can put in a link in the chat box in a moment, but on our Dyslexia Ireland website, we've created a new hub, and it has a section which is called Voices of Dyslexia, and in this area you can hear from a range of people who discuss their different experiences with dyslexia, kind of through a reflection process, but also they share insights and tips and strategies. So that could be also a beneficial place to learn more here.
Brilliant. It's great to hear those resources. And I often think people are so much quicker to accept that there will be variation and difference between neurotypical people, but there's a lot more assumptions that neurodivergent people will be completely similar. So thank you so much for that explanation. Jen, I'm going to come back to you. So it's Jen from As I Am, and Sonia had referenced the term ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, but people will, or perhaps will also have heard the term autism spectrum condition. And this person was wondering, why are organizations using ASC instead of ASD, and should we all adopt this?
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably a similar enough answer to what Sonia said, is the idea of, once again, looking for consensus when it's not possible to get consensus. But what we can do is, I suppose, look for opinions and how best we can respect those opinions. So organizations like As I Am have used the term ASC in terms of autism spectrum condition a lot more than ASD, simply because of what we were talking about earlier, is the connotations of the idea of the word disorder. and that negativity. And I was actually asked this question recently enough by my own mother. She asked me, she said, does condition have a negative connotation though? Which, you know, is an entirely fair question. And I was trying to explain to her, I suppose how I felt personally about it was that, to me, when I hear ASD, no matter what way I hear it as an autistic person, my brain hones in on the D there, and on that disorder. And if someone is talking about autism and they use ASD fluidly in a conversation rather than autistic, it's almost like the word disorder jumps out and kind of hits me in the face every time. Whereas condition still feels like an acknowledgement that to be autistic in an environment and in a society that isn't built for us, and a lot of the time has active barriers to us accessing employment, relationships, friendships, condition feels like we're still acknowledging the pain that can cause without putting the onus on maybe the individual themselves as having a condition that needs to be cured, a disorder that needs to be corrected, you know, a syndrome with symptoms or something like that. Instead, ASC feels like a acknowledgement also of the word, the spectrum, really, and the idea of having a spectrum of experiences within the community, whilst also understanding the idea that I suppose there can be challenges, there can be experiences that can feel overtly negative, but that maybe those aren't rooted in the autistic person themselves, and that they're rooted in how society is structured and what we need to change as a society. So I suppose, as I am generally, you know, we as an organisation survey the community really regularly, and like that, I suppose the closest we can come to a consensus, which isn't possible, but we can try, is that most people find that ASD, that use of disorder, either offensive or just a little bit hurtful, but also sometimes not accurate to someone's experience. So ASC can be used more frequently. You will see a lot of autistic people simply say autism and stick with that. But a lot of autistic people then that I work with and that are in some of the groups do say that they like to use ASC because they like that acknowledgement that it has spectrum in it, because it's showing that huge level of diversity without this kind of shadow of disorder over things.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for sharing your personal view on that as well, because I think that's a particularly personal one, isn't it, within the community regarding autism and ASC, and there's perhaps more consensus on the ASD piece. So I'm going to come to Sam now, and I'm mindful of time there. There's so much to discuss, but Sam, an individual is wondering, is it wrong or offensive to refer to dyspraxia as a disability? Do people with dyspraxia in their language dislike that?
It's always really important to check in with what the individual is comfortable with. But I know for me and for a lot of people is because of the physical part of dyspraxia, like I was mentioning earlier, and some stuff that also Sonia touched on, there are aspects of dyspraxia that does make a lot of people comfortable for using the word disability. I think as well for me, because like there are things that I experience pain from fine gross motor skills that I'm really bad at, and also that I didn't reach some of my milestones at the right time, and I had to get occupational therapy to be able to ride a bike, to be able to tie my shoelaces, to use a knife and fork, things like that. Is that, to me, I'm comfortable with the word disability. And sometimes I feel like when people are shadowing away from it, it kind of makes me feel like, well, it's easier for you to not, just because it's a hidden disability, it can be kind of easier for people to look at me and be like, it's almost dismissive to me, which can be kind of frustrating. So it's not offensive to use it, but it is also important. Some people might prefer not to use that and use the term that it's just their difference or their identity, which is also more than fine. So again, it's always important to just check in with the person. But I think for me, and because of such of the aspects of it, and as well what Sonia was saying about the world being catered to a lot of neurotypical ways, it can sometimes as well especially feel a lot like it is a disability. So yeah. Thank you.
And it comes back to that piece again, doesn't it, over personal preference. And Sonia, I'll come to you now around, I suppose, the pathology of ADHD. So this individual is making a point around, you know, should ADHD at a certain level be pathologized? And they feel the language can be very medical based, but then they make the point that medication, etc., can be involved. And in that regard, is there a place for medical based language? And I suppose they note that there seems to be a big gap between how the ADHD community refer to themselves and how psychologists and other clinical professionals speak about ADHD. And they, amongst many others, I guess, find it confusing.
And it is, it just highlights how tricky ADHD is, in particular with fitting into the neuroaffirmative movement. I suppose some acknowledgement needs to be given to the history of ADHD, particularly with advocacy groups and the ADHD community. They spent a long time trying to advocate that ADHD was real and that it was a medical condition. Before it was, as seen by the public, there was a lot of stigma around it, and it was seen as something that was made up, mostly to describe behavior concerns or poor parenting. So a lot of effort went into justify the existence of ADHD in medical terms. So, look, it's a difference in brain functioning. It's a disordered brain. We didn't just make up this term. Please help us with medication. And I suppose ADHD is different from other neurodivergences that we're talking about here this evening, and the fact that there is medication that a lot of individuals avail of, which essentially takes away a lot of ADHD and takes away some of the strengths of ADHD as well. So it is a trickier one to navigate with regards to pathologizing. There's always going to be a role for psychiatry and for the medical model within ADHD, because medication is there. And a lot of people from the ADHD community will seek out a diagnosis purely to access that medication as well. So that the wants and needs of the ADHD community can also vary differently from, when we're talking about dyslexia or we're talking about autism or dyspraxia. So it's going to be a very different journey, I think, for ADHD. So, where we place ADHD within our support framework as well in Ireland is quite telling. I mean, it's integrated in with mental health, where we're looking for cures for these things. So we're looking for cures for depression, we're looking for cures for anxiety, we're essentially looking for cures for ADHD. And that jars quite a lot with neuroaffirmative practice, where we're talking about acceptance at an individual level and at a wider societal level. So these are conversations that we're having in ADHD Ireland. These are conversations that we're having with the community that we represent. How do we as an organization, as an advocacy charity, go forward in supporting and representing the ADHDers in Ireland? What should we be advocating for? What ways should we be talking about ADHD? What ways should we be moving society and shaping how we interact with ADHD as well? And we're, like I said at the very beginning, I think we're behind where other groups of people are, and it will just take us a bit more time to come up. So there is pathologizing language out there, and that's mostly because it still is under that medical model umbrella with regards to first line intervention.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And I definitely think it was an important point that person raised, and great to hear the different sides to that. So I'm going to come over to Kiva now from Dyslexia Ireland. Just a parent, I assume, or a guardian was wondering, do you have any recommendations for how to describe dyslexia to my dyslexic child? They're very young, but I want them to understand it from a strengths perspective rather than deficits.
Perfect. So thank you. So yes, discussing dyslexia with your children from a very young age is extremely important. It's also really important that you use the word dyslexia. Don't shy away from it. And we would encourage everybody to use dyslexia in their everyday vocabulary, because we do want to try and remove some of that shame and stigma that's been incorrectly attached to being dyslexic. So therefore it's incredibly important that from a young age that we are hearing dyslexia, that we have a name for our difficulties, because sometimes if you don't have a name for your difficulties, what happens is you can internalize them as you mustn't be good enough, you must be, you know, stupid or whatever it is, and it turns out to be very, very negative and very damaging. So this is great that this parent or guardian wants to talk, you know, to their child, and also that their child is at a young age. You know, and I do understand and respect that the parent or the guardian wants to speak to their child and encourage their child to view their dyslexic profile in a positive manner, because solely, you know, coming from a deficit model has been kind of our traditional method, you know, and this is what feeds into that medical model of disability. And we all know it's really damaging and really negative. However, it is important that we also must be mindful that we don't feed too much into, you know, the flip side, where it ends up being that kind of toxic positivity, where, you know, we're talking about dyslexia being this bed of roses, that it's a superpower, that it's amazing. Because sometimes when we speak in these manners and we just solely speak about the strengths and we don't acknowledge the difficulties, this can do a disservice to our dyslexic children, because you know, we're not building resilience in them. We're not giving them a safe space where they can turn around and say, do you know what, I'm having a really, really hard day. It's really, really difficult being dyslexic today, or, you know, whatever maybe terminology they want to use when they're discussing their dyslexia. So it is incredibly important that you have an honest, an open, but a balanced view and conversation of dyslexia. It isn't always a bed of roses. There's days that it's going to be really hard, but it's okay to have these difficult days. It's really important that we name them, because this is what helps somebody develop, you know, positive strategies and techniques to kind of, you know, to help them on their dyslexic journey. Because remember, we're talking about a lifelong identification, and we need these tools and strategies. I am going to put some really good resources that Dyslexia Ireland have created. I'll put our links into the chat box, but just to note some of them, there's a great Dyslexia is Rubbish and Awesome video, and this is from a young person who is dyslexic, and he created this presentation around dyslexia awareness. But sometimes children can relate to this because it's another child talking about their strengths and their challenges. Also on our website, we do have a section specifically aimed at parents and how they can talk about dyslexia correctly and positively, but also that balanced view with their children. And then again, the hub I mentioned earlier, we have sections on that around empowering parents and, you know, looking at emotional well-being. So I'm going to drop those links into the chat box for people now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kiva. And I think it's such an important point about that balance, isn't it? Because we want to teach our children to be able to acknowledge and advocate for their own needs. So thank you for speaking to that balance piece. I'll come to Jen now from As I Am. And we hear this a huge amount, but this person was wondering, I was told it can be seen as rude to say we're all a little autistic, but I don't understand why. I've also heard high functioning and low functioning is rude. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you, Niamh. This is something we hear a lot, isn't it, really, in work. And it's, I suppose, something I almost have a twofold, probably emotional and intellectual response to, because I think when someone is saying, you know, if you disclose your diagnosis at any point and you say, you know, actually I'm autistic, or I was just diagnosed, there is a tendency, and particularly perhaps in Ireland, with people who are so well-meaning, who do say, sure, we're all a little autistic. And it's usually said with a smile and with absolute positive intentions, really. And whilst I kind of have that layer of understanding that there's positive intentions, I can understand why it kind of rankles with the community itself. Because in reality, and once again, I suppose when I'm talking about an autistic experience, I can only speak for what I experience, because as we know, the community is so diverse in everything. But being autistic to me is very much multifaceted. There's parts of my brain that I would not change ever, that I know are so linked to my autistic identity, and they're my strengths, and they're parts of how I can see details that other people don't see, and whether that's the color in a moment or the beauty of something that's so deep. But that doesn't mean there isn't also a huge depth of pain when it comes to living in a society that isn't built for you and sometimes feels like it openly rejects you. And that pain can be all-consuming at times, to the point where, if it's a sensory experience, can feel physical, really. as you're expected to keep moving. So it can feel a little bit, I suppose, kind of like someone is just simplifying actually the complexity of your entire being in a simple sentence of saying, we're all a little autistic. It feels like it's minimizing maybe your hugely positive experiences, but also the degree at which you suffer because of that difference in the society that is structured for the person who is saying that to your face, maybe, if they are neurotypical. So that can feel difficult. So I think that's where I would say I would recommend people to maybe err on the side of caution there. And as I've said 1,000 times, err on the side of kindness, really, and just don't say that. And I know it can be something where it's almost, it can just come out sometimes, but to understand maybe where the person is coming from if they find that difficult. When it comes to functioning labels, this is something that I think I didn't understand my own emotions towards at first. I really didn't understand why someone said, you know, and it was family members maybe that meant so well when I said, actually, I got my autism diagnosis. It makes a lot of sense to me. You know, I just rehearsed my whole spiel to tell them. And they said, oh, so you must be incredibly high functioning. And I didn't really understand for a long time why that felt like it rippled with me a bit. I was like, oh, I don't know. Whereas actually in talking to the community and people who've been maybe diagnosed longer than I have, and are so wise, really, I understand now that for many of us, when we are either told you must be very high functioning, or you must have a mild form of autism or something like that, once again, it feels like it minimizes those experiences, because in reality, it's not a linear spectrum, really, because whilst I can look like I'm high functioning, you can't see me, but I am doing air quotes, you know, in this webinar, for example, if you were to witness me in the middle of a crowd at a gig and there's music playing, it would be an entirely different experience and I would be an entirely different person. But my pain would be as equal to the comfort I feel right now, and both deserve to be acknowledged. And I think that's as clear when someone is also defined as being very low functioning. And we hear that usually when it's talking about someone. Oh, they're non-verbal, so they must be low functioning. There's a lot of connotations and associations made that I think are simplifying, once again, simplifying, and I suppose trying to neatly wrap up the complex identity of who someone is, which, like every neurotypical person out there, changes on a day-to-day basis based on the circumstance. So I think, I hope that adds a bit of clarity as to why people maybe struggle with that a little bit, and why we might just need to have a little bit of caution about that.
It does indeed, Jen. And I think it's like you're saying at the start of the presentation, I think it's when we engage with the language and learn, you know, why that may be perceived offensive, or actually break down what you are, you know, if you say low functioning, can you think about what you are saying about a person? And it's that engaging with the language piece and hearing reflections from yourself directly from the community. Okay, I'm now going to come to the last question, and then that will be enough out of me. And the last question is for Sam from Dyspraxia Ireland. And this speaks to the panelists as a whole, but the question is, do the panelists think if people identified as neurodivergent as opposed to individually autistic, dyslexic, etc., it would then lead to less stereotyping and facilitate the need for others to understand the individual rather than pigeonholing them into the medicalized versions of diagnoses?
Okay, yeah, it's very, very important to have both. For me as well, and for people, it's very important to have to be able to identify as neurodivergent, but also for me to be able to identify as dyspraxic. I mean, the benefits to being able to identify as neurodivergent have been amazing. Like, I've been the co-chair for the Neurodivergent Society in DCU for the past 2 years. And we've all come together and we do this thing called circle time. We sit around together and we like share like stories that we all relate to. And like as well, I'm not just dyspraxic, I have like ADHD and sensory processing disorder. So there are elements of things that I can even talk about. Like, my sister is autistic and we can share stories about sensory issues that we've had and things like that. And having that sense of community, even us being able to gather like this, is amazing. And having to be able to, you know, work in the field of being neurodivergent and catering classes around people being neurodivergent, things like that. It's really important that we have that sense of identity in that. But also, kind of similar to what Kiva was saying, is that having that individual diagnosis is very important, because like I know for me, before I was diagnosed, I had this idea that I was there was something wrong with me, that I was cursed, because I was always the one dropping things in class. I could never ride a bike. I could never process my thoughts. My room was always so disorganized, and I was like, it's like I really internalized that and had really low self-esteem from it. And when I got the OT assessment, it was completely life-changing to have you know, to be able to look at dyspraxia and fit it into me as a person, and to be able to, you know how to deal with the things that I was dealing with in life, and be able to, you know, have supports that would just help me to be at the same level as other people. And I understand that there is that fear of stereotypes, but I think if we're having stereotypes around, you know, different things like autism and dyspraxia and dyslexia, it's important to look at why are we stereotyping people this way, and eradicate that rather than eradicating the label. You know, because the label can be so important into getting the supports that you need and the individual supports that you need. Again, it is still really important as well to, like, even though I am dyspraxic, like, it is important that regardless, yes, it has helped me look at dyspraxia as a whole and know what supports I need. But, you know, even if you've met one dyspraxic person, you've just met one dyspraxic person. We're all still individuals. And there are certain supports that I might need that others don't. Like, for example, like, I needed a laptop in school in order to write, because I couldn't handwrite for long because my writing is illegible and I would just be in a lot of pain. However, I sort of said that I needed to not use the laptop for Irish, because looking at the letters in front of me would just confuse me with languages, different things like that, that you know, you still need to talk to people. And there might be other people, like I know I was even talking to another dyspraxic colleague of mine who was saying that he loves sports because it stimulates him in a sensory aspect. And then I'm the complete opposite, where I'm like, don't go near me with football or I will like cry, because like that noise would overwhelm me and things like that. So both labels or both identities are really, really important to have, but both for different ways. And again, just to reiterate that we're still all individuals, and getting to know what that person needs and that sports is like half the battle, you know, sometimes. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I think that was an incredibly powerful answer to end on. It's wonderful to see all the comments coming in through the chat as well, and the praise for all the panelists here tonight. So thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I'll hand over to Jen now and say goodbye.
Absolutely. I'm going to risk trying to keep my camera on simply because I'm smiling so much. And I've loved talking to you guys. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to go to the Q&A simply because there's such an influx of questions. But I think what we can do really is I have set the chat and the Q&A to export whilst keeping people's individual information private and anonymous. And I think it might be worth us as panelists coming together to chat about potentially meeting again and answering some more questions. Because I think if we've learned anything tonight, it's that there's such a breadth of information for us to learn from, and that we only got the tip of the iceberg tonight, really. But I'd like to just thank everyone for their questions that have come in. For the sake of everyone's privacy, we did keep the questions in the chat private as well, but I really do appreciate them, and all of the panelists do as well. They've been very, very constructive, and they've definitely informed our discussion and will inform our discussions going forward. So I'm going to just remind everyone, I'm going to follow up with everyone tomorrow and send on the recording, and I'll send on the slides at the start as well. Just in case anyone would like them. But I'd like to thank the rest of my lovely panelists who are fantastic. And to Niamh, thank you so much for being so patient and asking all of those questions, and to Ken for answering our chat and people who are asking questions as well. That's been really, really beneficial, because I think the more of us that come together, the better, really. But once again, to everyone here who came, gave your time, gave your evenings to ask your questions, and a lot of people to choose to be vulnerable with those, I suppose, uncertainties around language. The more we talk about it, the better we can get at expressing what we don't know. And I think that's how we can learn, really, guys. So I'm going to finish up here and let everyone go back to their lives. But once again, thank you guys so much. Really, really appreciate it. I'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.